Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. This webinar topic is baking without milk, eggs, soy, nuts, wheat, and gluten with cookbook author Colette Martin. I'm Linda Mitchell and once again I'm president of Kids with Food Allergies and I have the privilege of being your moderator today. Today our presenter and our medical advisory team representative Deb Indurato, RD, LDN, will be discussing how to use substitutes for common allergens. This will be interesting and fun, so I'm really glad you've joined us today. I want to give a special thanks to our two presenters. The presenters for all of our webinars are doing so as volunteers and without compensation. I'm very grateful to both of them for being here today and donating their time to us so we can all learn together. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few important housekeeping details about this webinar. During this time, we're going to put up a few quick polls for you to take. First of all, today's webinar is made possible through an unrestricted educational grant from Mylan Specialty. We rely on donors and corporate partners like Mylan Specialty for the financial support that enables us to develop educational programming like we have today. Next, please remember that this webinar is of a general nature and is not medical advice. You should consult your own physician or healthcare provider for any medical advice you seek regarding food allergies or any related medical conditions. And please, we don't imply that any food ingredients products that may be mentioned today may be safe for your family. You need to consult your own physician and do your own due diligence to check labels and to verify contents of products for your own child's safety. Today's webinar is being recorded. We also have a large audience here again today, so you are all in listen-only mode. But we do want this to be interactive, so we're putting up these polls that you get to take, and also you will see a questions panel in your GoToWebinar controls, and you can type in comments and questions there, and at the end of the session we will start fielding some questions to our two presenters to answer from the ones we receive in the audience today. Colette will begin her presentation about common allergens and how to substitute them in recipes, and our dietitian Deb Indurato will then add her comments after Colette's presentation. Following that, we will have a question and answer session like I mentioned, and we're also going to have a few giveaways. Colette is going to donate 2 copies of her book, Learning to Bake Allergen Free, and we also have 3 lunch boxes from Allermates that we'll be giving out to those of you in the audience toward the end of the session that we pick randomly. So what I'd like to do now is to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Colette Martin, and then we'll get started with her presentation. Colette Martin is a writer, speaker, and 30-year veteran of corporate America. Colette is also a food allergy mom and an expert on how to bake allergen-free. When her own son was diagnosed with eosinophilic esophagitis in 2001, allergies to wheat, milk, eggs, soy, and peanuts, she had to reinvent how her family ate. Having first learned to bake in her grandmother's kitchen that was full of wheat, butter, milk, and eggs, Colette understands firsthand the challenges that it presents, and she had to transform her kitchen to accommodate these multiple food allergies. As she modified her recipes to eliminate the top 8 food allergens and gluten, she then discovered her own intolerance to wheat and soy. Colette currently serves in a volunteer capacity as the vice chairperson of the Kids with Food Allergies Board of Directors, so we're really pleased for her to be here today and donate her time. So Colette, we're going to unmute you now, and we want to thank you for joining us here today and for sharing what you know about all these substitutes and your journey to collect that information and share it through your cookbook and through this webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda, and thank you for inviting me to talk with the kids with food allergies, moms and dads out there, especially this time of year. I know that baking when your kids have multiple food allergies can be quite a challenge, and so this time of year, probably more than any other, we all notice that we're missing certain ingredients and that we have difficulty with some of these. But as you noted, I do bake without wheat, gluten, dairy, soy, eggs, or nuts, and that was out of necessity because my son is allergic to all of those foods. But I think, as probably most of the folks on the call have noticed, almost every recipe for baked goods calls for the ingredients wheat, butter, dairy milk, and eggs. And the other one that almost every recipe calls for is sugar, and thankfully that's one ingredient that most of us don't have to substitute for. And then I think a lot of us are also dealing with the challenge of different family members with different food restrictions, also trying to balance food allergies with somebody else in the family who might have celiac disease or diabetes, or somebody who's now eating vegan. And so there are a lot of reasons why people have food restrictions, and of course that makes it a real challenge for all of us. So Melanie, do we have the results of the, here we go, the results of the polls. So it looks fairly mixed. Not surprisingly, milk comes out on top, followed by peanuts and or tree nuts, and wheat and eggs are kind of in the middle, as well as kind of quite a few people out there needing to avoid soy, like my family does. Okay, not surprising. Skill level. Okay, so everybody here seems to have done, or not everybody, most people seem to have done some baking, but again, not surprisingly, experience with traditional ingredients, but not with substitutes. So that's great. I think everybody who's here hopefully will learn something today, and as Linda noted, we'll take some questions at the end and hopefully help you with your biggest challenges. And so what are those challenges? Finding flours that work. Oh, that's one of my favorite topics. Replacing eggs, that is one of the most difficult things. And baking foods my child will actually eat. Yes, of course. All right, great. So let's get right into the presentation. And I'm going to, for this particular presentation, I'm going to focus on the biggies. And so let's start with milk. And I'm going to start with milk. Melanie, there we go. Because it's actually one of the easiest. And maybe a lot of you have already figured out how to substitute for milk. The good news is that there really are a lot of non-dairy options out there. I think probably what many of us have noticed is that the typical replacement for dairy milk frequently is soy milk, but then again, many of us have to avoid that. But probably the three that I use the most frequently when I'm baking are rice, hemp, and coconut milk beverage. You can see on the slide just a couple of examples of some of the milks that I like to use. Hemp milk is really one of my favorites, and I really like it for a couple reasons. One is because it has a wonderful nutritional profile, and it does so. It has calcium, it has vitamin A, it has essential omegas, and it does all of that without having to add in additional ingredients. The hemp seeds provide that themselves. The milk that you see in the middle on this slide is made by So Delicious Company, and it's a coconut milk beverage, which is a little bit different than the very, very heavy, very rich in fat coconut milks that come in the can. This one is actually made for drinking. One of the things that all of these milks that come in the carton have in common is that they stay shelf stable for many, many months. If you buy a container today, it probably doesn't have an expiration date until sometime in 2014. So that actually makes it really easy for you to use a variety of these milks as you're replacing dairy milk. Once they're opened, of course, you do need to put them in the refrigerator, and once they're opened, they do have, they'll expire probably within a few weeks, but not as quickly as cow's milk does after 7 to 10 days. So you'll find that you can keep them in the refrigerator for quite a while. Most of these non-dairy milks also come in different flavors. They come in what's typically known as original, which is kind of like your plain version, chocolate versions, and vanilla versions. I actually sometimes like to use the chocolate milks when I'm making chocolate recipes. It kind of provides a nice additional chocolate flavor. And you can also find these milks in unsweetened varieties, which are really, really good for baking, especially if you're trying to keep your sugar content on the lower side. The formula for how to replace dairy milk is the easiest. You simply replace it 1 for 1. If a recipe calls for 1 cup of milk, you can use 1 cup of hemp milk, 1 cup of coconut milk beverage. And also, you know, if you're not allergic to them, soy, almond, oat milks are sometimes options for those who are allergic to dairy. Couple things to remember. Milk is milk. So that means powdered milk, lactose-free milk, those are all still milk and they're not dairy-free. And then coconut can be a little bit confusing because even though coconut is not actually a tree nut, although some people can be allergic to coconuts, they will be labeled as tree nuts on the packaging. So your So Delicious dairy-free coconut milk that you see here in the picture will say contains tree nuts on the label, and that can be confusing even though there may not actually be any tree nuts in that particular milk. So those are things that you need to check. And also keep in mind, rice milk is very commonly called for in recipes for people who are cooking dairy-free, but rice milk is often processed in the same facilities as soy milk. So if you do have a soy allergy, that's another one that you want to check in terms of the brand that you use. So just like milk is milk, butter is also milk. And butter really comes into play when we're talking about baking very frequently, especially when you're baking pies, cookies. Most of them use butter. And the butter and oils are kind of interesting. The trick is really to know whether or not what you want is a solid, meaning you really want to choose a shortening, or whether or not an oil or a liquid for your fat will be a good option. So when a recipe calls for butter, I recommend that you use shortening. And one of the tricky things about shortening is, just like a margarine, most shortenings are combinations of oils and sometimes proteins. And so you really have to check the labels very carefully on any of your shortening ingredients. Whereas when you're using oils, typically your oil will be just that particular oil. So olive oil is all olives, grapeseed oil is all grape seeds. And so it makes it a little bit easier to find something that might be suitable. One of my favorites for shortening, you can actually see in the visual here, is the Earth Balance Natural Shortening, which does contain soybean oil, although no soy proteins, and it now contains flaxseed oil. That's a change that they made very recently. And of course they did that so that they could up the nutritional profile for that product, but for anybody who's allergic to seeds and especially flax, that product may now be off limits for you. But I find that that particular shortening works really, really well. Coconut oil is also, even though it's called an oil, can be a really good replacement for shortening because it's a solid at room temperature. So if you're looking for something to cut into your flour when you're making pies or cookie doughs, coconut oil can work really, really well. One of the shortenings that is made from a single oil is the Spectrum Organics Natural Shortening, which is pure palm fruit oil. That tends to be a good choice for anybody who is concerned about the soybean oils or the flaxseed oils in some of the other products. But what I can tell you is that all of the ones I've listed here work as a shortening. The Earth Balance coconut spread is actually a relatively new product. And and it has really a nice flavor, and I actually even really like that one just as a replacement for butter on toast or to eat straight up. The soy-free natural buttery spread has no soy proteins or soybean oil in it. And that one is not quite as solid as the others, so it doesn't perform quite as well. If you do need to go with that product, you're going to want to make sure your dough is really, really well refrigerated before you start rolling out a crust or starting to make your cookies. So oils, there actually are a lot of choices for oils out there. The ones that I like the best for baking are the milder oils, things like grapeseed oil or sunflower oil. Canola oils are typically genetically modified, but if you can find one that's not, there's no reason why you have to go with the non-genetically modified oil. From a food allergy perspective, I just prefer to use the non-GMO versions. And then other oils for people who have really unique needs, or when you want a specific taste, olive oil, hemp oil, and avocado oils are all good choices. But there are plenty of other oil choices out there, and oils can very easily be substituted for each other. So if a recipe calls for a quarter cup of grapeseed oil, go ahead and substitute sunflower, canola, or whichever one you choose, and that will work fine. The same thing is true in terms of the formula for replacing butter. 1 tablespoon of shortening equals 1 tablespoon of butter, and you would replace those in equal amounts. Couple things to remember. Most margarines contain some form of dairy. So again, most margarines will have many ingredients on the label. You need to read the entire label. Not just where it has the voluntary food allergy information. You need to read through the whole thing to make sure there's nothing in there that's a problem for you. And then again, the FDA does not require that oils be labeled as food allergens. Some companies do that on their own. So they will call it out as contains soy even though it says just soybean oil. But they do not have to say that. So that's something just to keep in mind, and yet another reason why you need to read every single detail of the labels. Shortenings can be used as oils, but not vice versa. So what do I mean by that? That means that if all you have is Earth Balance Natural Shortening in your refrigerator and the recipe calls for an oil, you can melt that either in your microwave or in a small saucepan on the stove and use that as a replacement for oil, and it will work just fine. If a recipe calls for butter or shortening, you really want to go with one of these choices up top or some other choice that will remain solid at room temperature, and that's my test for determining whether or not I call something a shortening or an oil. Okay, so let's move off of dairy and start talking about eggs. Eggs, as many of you noted in the Q&A, are one of the biggest challenges. And one of the reasons that eggs can cause so much difficulty for us when we're trying to replace them in baking is that there is no single substitute that does everything that an egg does. An egg from a chicken, when you're baking with it, it turns from a liquid into a solid. It provides texture, it provides taste, and it provides leavening. And there is no product yet on the market that I'm aware of that can provide all of those things in an egg replacer. So what you want to choose really depends on what you're trying to achieve. One of my favorites, especially if I'm making something with a batter, so that would be things like muffins or cupcakes, cakes, quick breads, things like that, is to use applesauce or any other fruit puree. One of the things that you should remember about this is that if you do use a fruit puree, it will provide some flavor. Applesauce will be fairly mild, but you can also, for example, use like a mango fruit puree. And if you use mango in your cupcakes, it will have a definite mango taste. So just be aware of that when you choose to do that. The formula for using fruit as a replacement for an egg is 1/4 cup per egg. So if a recipe calls for 2 eggs, you would use 1/2 cup of applesauce. I always opt for the natural unsweetened applesauce, or I make my own, so it's just pure apples and I don't have to worry about any other ingredients in there. Flaxseed gel is actually another one of my favorites. And what you see in the picture here is flax seeds. On the top left, you can see some whole golden flax seeds. I like to use the golden flax seeds because they don't add that brownish speckle to my baked goods. But you can use the brown flax seeds. They'll work just fine, and they'll provide the same effect. Then on the top right, you can see the ground flax seeds. Flax seeds actually have to be ground so that they can be digested, and they should be ground to make them into flaxseed gel. And the formula is pretty easy. Again, you see it on the chart. It's 1 tablespoon of ground flaxseed meal. You mix that with 3 tablespoons of warm water for each replacement egg that you're trying to make. So what you see in the center of that picture then is what it starts to look like after it's been sitting for a few minutes. And if you should let it sit for about 5 minutes, and I just use like a little tiny whisk to stir it up. And it starts to get very gloppy. In fact, of all the egg replacers that we're talking about here, this and chia seed gel are the only ones that kind of have that gloppy, mushy, egg-like texture. But once you've let your flax seeds soak up the water for a little while, they do start to get that texture. And they not only add great texture to your baked goods, but they also add some great nutritional content as well. You can do the same thing with chia seeds. Chia seeds don't have to be ground. You can use them whole. And you mix just less. Chia seed gel is much thicker, so you would use 1/2 tablespoon of chia seeds to 3 tablespoons of warm water for each replacement egg that you're trying to make. Now, if you really need the leavening options for an egg, the thing to do may be to use the packaged egg replacers. So one of the examples, and one of the ones that I like to use, is from Allergy. It's ENER-G, and it's called Allergy Egg Replacer. Each egg replacer, the egg replacers are basically chemicals. They're kind of like souped up baking powders, and they give you a way to provide that extra lift and extra leavening in your baking. So sometimes if you're making things like yeast breads, some of these packaged egg replacers can be a good option to use. But you can also sometimes get a similar effect by using a little bit more baking powder. In fact, if you were converting a traditional recipe to an allergen-free recipe and you needed to replace the eggs, I would double the baking powder called for in the recipe as a general rule of thumb. Carbonated water is also another potential option to help provide some added lift, because that's really what you're getting when you get the leavening from the egg. So there is no single egg substitute that does it all, but there is an answer for everything that we want to make in terms of a replacement for eggs. So now I'm going to switch to talking about wheat. And I actually think that next to eggs, wheat is one of the most difficult to replace. And I've got actually a couple of slides on wheat because there's a number of key points. But the first thing I want to point out is that wheat flour is wheat, spelt, kamut, einkorn, and gluten flours are wheat, rye, and barley. If you're allergic to wheat, you may be able to have rye and barley, but typically rye and barley are processed in the same factories and on the same equipment as wheat. So for the most part, those of us who are allergic to wheat will need to avoid all of those, and those of us who need to be gluten-free will need to avoid all of those. But take a look for a second at the list of wheat-free and gluten-free flours. And I did this on purpose because I wanted you to see how many choices there are. It's not obvious when you go to the grocery store that there are so many other grains out there that you can use, but there are a whole bunch of them, and when they're used in combination with each other, really give you some very flavorful baked goods and breads, and give you a world of options beyond your plain old wheat bread. And so rice, it comes in a variety of, there's rice, and then there's brown rice, and then there's also sweet rice, which we'll talk about in a second. You've got a lot of flours that provide you lots of different kinds of flavoring. Sorghum has a tendency to take on the flavor of the other flours that it's mixed with, so that one is a very nice mild kind of go-to in a flour blend. Corn and millet are related. Those with corn allergies may also need to avoid millet. But for those who aren't allergic to corn or millet, that's yet another flavorful way to add some variety into your baked goods. And buckwheat is not wheat. I'll just make that really clear. In fact, it's on the other end of the spectrum of grains from wheat, so it's actually quite safe for those with wheat allergies. But then again, the other thing to remember too is that some folks, you can be allergic to any of these grains, and so you need to choose the ones that you're not allergic to. A lot of gluten-free bakers tend to like to use coconut and almond flours, which may or may not be options for you. If you're going to go with an oat flour, opt for a gluten-free oat flour, just to ensure that it's not made on the same equipment with wheat. But one of the keys to flours when you're replacing wheat is you can't replace them one for one. If you try to take just rice flour and use a cup of rice flour instead of wheat flour, you're going to have very bland, very crumbly, very dry baked goods. And so one of the tricks is to mix your flours together. Another thing to remember is when you're looking for flour blends, now especially those who are allergic to tree nuts are going to be concerned about where are the flours made and are they made on the same equipment as other things that you might be allergic to. So keep in mind that when you're looking at gluten-free flour blends, and there are a number of great ones that you can get off the shelf now, some of them are made in dedicated gluten-free facilities, some of them are made in gluten-free and dairy facilities, and some are made in top 8 allergen-free facilities. So depending on what your particular food allergies are, you want to make sure that you pick one that works and is safe for your family. So moving on then to the next thing about replacing wheat is to think about starches and gums. And these are two components of every flour blend that you'll want to use. When you're combining flours and without wheat, you always want to include a starch. Now, the starches are, they're usually very fine, they're very white, and they're essentially nutrient-free. What you see in the picture on the right is kind of just a bowl of arrowroot starch. It happened to be what I had the day I was taking pictures. And so you don't want to use more starch than you need to. My typical rule of thumb is to use between 1/4 cup and 1/2 cup of starch in a 2-cup flour blend. Many gluten-free flour blends off the shelf will use more than that, and many other gluten-free bakers will call for more than that in a recipe. But you really don't need to. As long as you've got enough of the starch to help provide that stickiness is really what the starch will do. In your flour blend, you'll be okay. The other thing you need to think about is gums, and this is something that we add because we've actually lost the gluten in the wheat. A gum is really kind of like what it sounds. It's like a glue, and if you take a little bit of xanthan gum and you mix it up with a little bit of water and you let it sit for a while, you'll see that it becomes really gummy and glue-like. And so if you imagine what that does when you're baking, it really just, again, helps to hold things together. It helps you to be able to do things like slice a loaf of bread. And so 2 of the options that are used most commonly are xanthan gum and guar gum. And again, I recommend using as little as you need to for this particular ingredient. There's a couple reasons for that. One of them is that gums can be very expensive, and you know, when you buy xanthan gum, it comes in a really small package. Just buy 1 at a time, because it will last you a really, really long time if you're only using a 1/4 teaspoon for every cup of flour. And what I usually do is I take 1/2 of the package, I put it in an airtight container, and I stick it in the freezer. I put the other 1/2 in the refrigerator, and that way it will last longer, because again, it's expensive and you don't want it to go bad. Some of the off-the-shelf gluten-free flour blends contain the gum, and others don't. So you need to be aware of that as you're baking, on whether or not you need to add in the xanthan gum yourself, or whether or not it's already in there. But because of the nature of this gum, you really want to make sure you blend it extremely well with the flour. So when you're mixing your dry ingredients, typically you'll put your flour, your sugar, your baking powder, your salt, and your xanthan gum in a bowl and mix it really, really well together before you mix it in with your wet ingredients. And then there's one more thing we need to talk about when we talk about replacing wheat, and that's that weight matters. So Melanie, if we can go to the next slide. There we go. If there's one thing that you get out of this discussion, or you remember out of this discussion, it's that you need to adjust the weight of your flour, or you need to adjust the recipe to account for the weight of your flour. So here's the thing. Most wheat flours weigh between 120 and 124 grams per cup. Gluten-free flours, and most of them weigh on the much heavier end, but gluten-free flour blends tend to weigh between 120 and 160 grams per cup. If you're following a recipe that was made for wheat, intended to be at 124 grams per cup, and you're using a flour blend that weighs 160 grams per cup, you're going to end up with a pastry that's rock hard, it won't rise, and when you're finished, you're going to say, oh, I probably should have used more flour. But the real answer is you should have used less flour. You need to make sure you account for the weight of your flour when you're baking. In most cases, you'll be using less flour than you did when you were baking with wheat. So this is a little bit tricky because different recipes are made to different weights of flour. So the easiest way to account for this is to take a look at what the flour blend was that they were using, and then using something that weighs similar. Now there's a couple ways you can do this. I actually like using a scale. and then I can get my flour right at, I develop my recipes to 120 to 130 grams per cup. And so if I'm making something that calls for 2 cups of flour, I can measure it out at exactly 260 grams, and I know I've got exactly the right amount of flour. So that's the secret. The secret is to adjust the amount of flour to the recipe that you're using. If you're replacing wheat in a recipe, just weigh the flour to 124 grams per cup, or adjust it by taking a couple of tablespoons of flour out per cup that you use. Okay, now let's talk about some of the things that we haven't touched on yet. And I know that there are folks out there who are allergic to more than wheat, dairy, and eggs. Corn is one of those lurking things when you're baking. Many baking powders and almost all powdered sugars contain corn. You can find corn-free version, and it's usually the corn starch that they put in there so that it doesn't all stick together. So you can find corn-free versions of these, but you do need to search for those. If you need something other than corn starch, tapioca starch and arrowroot starch are equally exchangeable for cornstarch. If you have a recipe that calls for cornmeal, either leave the cornmeal off, or sometimes I'll use quick cooking oats, the gluten-free versions, to provide sort of a coating for a bread or something like that. Couple things to think about. People who are allergic to rice, and this is actually one of the questions I get most frequently, is what do you recommend if I need a flour blend that doesn't contain rice? Because nearly all of the off-the-shelf flour blends contain rice. One that doesn't is a bean-based flour blend from Bob's Red Mill, or you can mix your own if rice is a concern. We haven't really talked much about soy lecithin, but soy lecithin is an ingredient you find in a lot of baked goods. You find it in a lot of chocolate chips, even gluten-free and dairy-free chocolate chips. Many of them contain soy lecithin. Many chocolate bars contain soy lecithin. Soy is one of those iffy things that you need to work with your doctor to determine whether or not it's okay for you. It is a fat component, and typically food allergies are to the proteins, not the fats. And so many of us with soy allergies are fine with soy lecithin, but I have talked to folks who say that soy lecithin is a concern for them. And in that case, you need to make sure, especially when you're looking for chocolate products, that you choose one that is completely soy-free. And Enjoy Light Foods is one of those options for you. They make both a mini chocolate chip and a chocolate chunk chip that work beautifully for baking. Coconut, we've already talked about the fact is not an actual nut, but the FDA decided that it was, so it's labeled as a nut. And so why is this a problem? Well, it's confusing both for people who have actual coconut allergies and confusing for people who have tree nut allergies but not coconut allergies in terms of how products are labeled. So when you see that, if you see a coconut product that is labeled as contains tree nuts, you just want to double check that to make sure that the tree nuts they're talking about are simply coconut and not other tree nuts. And then oats, in the last couple of years, there are some companies who've started to make gluten-free oats. Now, oats don't actually contain gluten or wheat, but the reason they are a concern for many people is that they're processed on the same equipment as wheat. But there are many companies, including Bob's Red Mill is one, that have started to make gluten-free versions to avoid that contamination. So just a couple final thoughts before we get to questions, and I know I'm talking a lot and I want to have time for questions. But, you know, the most important thing is always to follow your doctor's instructions, and if you're not sure about a product, ask. And if after asking you're still not sure, leave it on the shelf, don't eat it. The detailed ingredients, you need to look at those as well as the optional advisory labels. The FDA says that the top 8 food allergens have to be called out on every food label, but that little part underneath the detailed ingredients that says may contain or contains or food allergen information, that is voluntary. So what that means is that you must read the entire label, and if you're not sure if the ingredients are safe for you, call the company and ask. And if after calling them you're not happy or you're still not sure, again, you know, I always opt on the side of safety. Choose to leave it on the shelf if it doesn't look like it's going to work for you. And there is no one answer that works for everybody. I've been focusing on the top allergens here. Many of you out there I know have other foods that you also have to avoid, and different lists of ingredients to avoid. And so there is no one size fits all that when we start talking about food allergies. So you need to do what works for you and your family, and always check. And ingredients change. For example, the Earth Balance Natural Shortening that I talked about earlier, I've been using it for a long time, and the packaging didn't change, but on the little label, they suddenly now are also using flax oil, which is not a concern for my family, but maybe for yours. So that's just a good reminder that we always need to check. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking and see what questions we have.
Okay, thanks, Colette. I really appreciate your giving us this this overview. It was really detailed, and we really do appreciate it. What I'd like to do now is turn the mic over to Deb Indurato so she can give us some comments regarding what Colette spoke about and maybe fill in some gaps or give us some additional tips. Deb's always insightful and helpful. And before Deb gets started, I want to apologize for my microphone, which is not working very well. It's not behaving today, and I apologize for that. So I'll try to do my best to speak up, and hopefully you'll be able to hear most of what I say. Deb?
Okay, thank you. And I apologize in advance for any background noise because of my location today. Colette actually gave us an excellent presentation, and I don't know that there's too much that I need to add to that. And we'll see what comes up with the questions, and I'll support any questions that need to be answered that they may have some nutritional things for me. Actually, you're taking away a great treasure of information from this presentation today, and it's one of the best ones I've heard about baking allergen-free. There are just a few points that I want to caution people about, and with it being the holidays, there are going to be a lot of people want to, help you out and bake gifts and, think they're doing you a favor, but the intentions may be very good, but relatives and friends may not have the knowledge that all of us have, the professionals that are providing the information, as well as the moms who are very, very experienced in baking for their families, allergen-free. So the relatives and friends, they really don't know what we know, and they may not know what they're doing. And just to, excuse me, give an example, someone might think a low cholesterol egg substitute is really a substitute for someone who's egg allergic. And that's actually not true, as we all know. But our relatives and friends may not know that. So we can nicely thank them for the gifts that they are offered and be very cordial, but I would definitely not feed them to our allergic family members. And we've heard the information on checking the ingredients, and we just can't stress reading labels enough, even on some of our substitutes, because those things can change as well. So I thank everybody for attending, and thank you for having me a part of this today. And I am going to mute until I have a question for me.
Okay, Deb, thanks so much. I'm going to just remind everybody we got a lot of requests for recipes for this or recipes for that. Please check our website. We've got a lot of free recipes and recipes in our database that are searchable by whatever allergens you need to avoid. And we also have an online community with a very active food and cooking support forum. So if you need a new recipe for pumpkin pie because you don't like the one we have on our website or whatever the case is, just ask in our support forums because we got some really knowledgeable moms there who know how to convert recipes and do the proverbial gold out of straw when it comes to making allergen-friendly recipes. And I encourage you to just take advantage of that. It's free. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and move forward with our announcements for our giveaways. As I mentioned, Colette has donated 2 books of her Learning to Bake Allergen-Free, which is I don't want to say unusual because that doesn't sound positive. It's a very interesting book because the first half of it is basically an overview in more detail of all the kind of things that Colette spoke about today in her presentation. So there's a lot of chemistry experiments and showing how things behave in recipes and how they don't behave. And so it's really kind of an interesting read, especially if you have to substitute for eggs or wheat. And then Allermates donated some lunch boxes, and so we have 3 of them to give away. So first I'll give away the cookbooks, and those will go to Charissa, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, Charissa Mobley and Pam Womack. And then the lunch boxes will go to Monica Malapalli, Michelle Bell Badger, and Felicia Conifal. So thank you so much for being here with us for the webinar today, and I hope you enjoy your gifts. We'll be in touch by email to make arrangements to ship those to you. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and open up the floor for questions and answers. You've given us a lot of questions along the way when Colette was speaking, so I'll just go ahead and start with some ones that maybe were covered, but let's just reinforce them. First of all, Colette, are starches interchangeable equally? Can I replace cornstarch with tapioca in a recipe and get the same result?
Yes, you can. You can replace cornstarch with tapioca or arrowroot starch, and you will essentially get the same result. The one I probably didn't talk about as much, if for some reason you can't use any of those starches, you can also use sweet rice flour instead of a starch. That one won't work quite the same, but it's an option if that's the only thing available to you.
Okay, great. How about an alternative to make pudding? Is there a good milk substitute for puddings?
Well, I would say it depends on what kind of pudding you're making. But I've made many puddings with hemp milk, which I think is great, especially if you want to make like a vanilla pudding. Or rice milk also tends to work really well for puddings.
Okay. Do you have any experience with coconut milks or any of those kind of things for puddings? Have you tried those?
I actually haven't tried a pudding with coconut milk, but I imagine that it would work really well. And I would tend to go with one of the thicker coconut milks if I were doing a pudding. And also now you can find So Delicious makes a coconut milk creamer, which is a thicker version of their coconut milk beverage. It's kind of intended to be a replacement for like the creamer that you would put in your coffee. And adding a little bit of that into a pudding would probably be a great thing to do.
Okay. Let me see. Can I use coconut milk to replace butter in cookies and muffins?
I wouldn't use coconut milk to replace the butter. I would use coconut oil to replace the butter in the cookies and muffins.
That's what I meant. I read the question wrong, sorry.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, terrific. Let's see what else I can ask you. Do you add the gums at the same time to when you're mixing in the flours? Is there any, sequence of adding those things together to get the best result?
it doesn't really matter what order you add the gums in with your dry ingredients, but I do see another question here that I'll add in at the same time, because I see that somebody asked if gums should be added to the oil before adding it to the flour. So here's the thing about gums. Always mix them in first really well with your dry ingredients. And it doesn't really matter whether, you know, I always put the flour in first and then the sugar and then the gums, but it doesn't really matter what order you do that as long as all your dry ingredients are mixed together really well. I would specifically not add the gums to an oil or any other liquid prior to mixing it in with the rest of your ingredients. And the reason for that is that as soon as a gum hits a liquid, it starts to gum up. And so you don't want that happening before it's mixed in really well with your flour.
Okay, great. How do you know when flours or starches go bad?
Starches tend to not go bad very often. Unfortunately, there's like no protein in them, so there's not much to go bad. Flours typically will take on a fairly strange smell if they start to go bad. For the most part, I like to keep my gluten-free flours in the refrigerator. Once they're opened, that will just, you know, help the shelf life. And if you're baking, you know, fairly frequently, you don't usually need to worry about them going bad. But the ones that are more likely to go bad are the ones that have higher protein levels. So things like the bean flours, especially, will take on a really, really weird smell once they start to go bad.
Okay. Can you explain what hemp is made of?
Hemp seeds. So hemp is the seed itself. So the hemp seeds are there. It's a whole food. It's a plant. There are a lot of people who tend to think of hemp as being related to marijuana. And there's a whole long story about why that is the case, but there's nothing about hemp that you need to be concerned about. It's actually a very, very healthy food for you. And it is a whole food. It's made from hemp seeds. Hemp seeds, interestingly, are not allowed to be grown in the U.S., and that, again, goes back to our laws that are still on the books that sort of lump hemp in with marijuana.
Okay, this question might be more for Deb, and that is the, you know, allergenicity of seeds, and if you're allergic to one seed, should you avoid them in recipes? Hemp, flax, chia, whatever.
Yeah, is Deb muted?
Yeah, I had some background noise, so I was waiting a second. Actually, seeds are a tricky thing because I've worked with a lot of patients who are allergic to individual seeds but don't have a problem across the board with other seeds. So that would be one that I would suggest that an individual discuss with their allergist.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Deb. And there was someone who asked Bob's red mill flour, which you had talked about being good for certain things, doesn't that have a shared facility warning on it?
Yes, it does. The Bob's Red Mill flours are made in a shared facility, I believe, with tree nuts. And so those who are allergic to tree nuts will very likely want to avoid the Bob's Red Mill products.
Would you like to comment on the shared facility? Maybe Deb even wants to be the one answering this, and that is the whole issues with cartons of milk alternatives and how some of them are made in shared facilities, and how to approach finding a safe one.
I think that can be a tricky question because of all the concerns we have about cross-contamination, and I find it's best to try to call the facility and see if you can get further information from them. if there's an 800 number on the carton, because sometimes you don't always have that information. So it's better to be on the safe side and avoid, if possible, if there's a severe allergy. But like I said, I would call the food company and also find if they have a dietitian working for them, or who their customer service person is. You need to get to the right people. And if many food companies do have dietitian spokespersons and representatives, or they might have somebody in their food chemistry department, and that would be a great person to be your resource rather than someone that just fields questions coming into the company. And
Okay,
it's very important to explain that, you know, no matter what the level of the allergy is, I would always tell the food company it is a severe allergy and you want to know the information.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's really helpful, Deb. Colette, do you have a favorite gluten-free blend that you use? What that you would like
Yeah,
to?
I actually have lots of favorites, but there's a couple that I'll mention. One of the brands that I really like for flours is King Arthur flour, and one of the reasons I like them, they tend to be very universal because they do make their gluten-free products in a top 8 allergen-free facility. And so they tend to be suitable for many, if not most, of the people who are on this call. They have 2 different flour blends that I really like a lot. One of them comes in the blue and white box, which is kind of like it's a rice-based blend, but it's a really good rice blend and works extremely well. Some rice blends tend to be very grainy. This one is a really, really, really nice texture. And then they also make a whole grain gluten-free flour blend that contains amaranth and sorghum and teff and some of the other grains that have higher nutrients, and that's also one of my favorite flours. But that one you need to go to their website to buy, unless you live in Vermont, and then you can go to their store.
Okay, terrific. Let me see what else I can ask, because we've got a whole bunch of questions coming in here. Well, someone asked a few minutes ago, my allergy bread rises, looks wonderful, and then falls. Is that something that you can help explain?
Yeah, I think I might need to know a little bit more information. I presume they're talking about a yeast bread, but I'm not really sure. If we're talking about a yeast bread, it could be that they're letting the yeast, letting it rise too long before putting it into the oven. When you're making yeast breads that are gluten-free, you only need 1 rise cycle, and you want to make sure that it doesn't rise too long. You get it into the oven fairly quickly. If they're talking about quick bread, it could be that they need more baking powder, or it could be that they're using too much flour. So I'm not sure if that was terribly helpful, but I'm happy to diagnose that one further with whoever had the question.
Okay, thanks so much. I think that about wraps up the questions and answers, the bulk of them anyhow. So I'm going to share the questions that have come in with Colette, and she's going to go through and see if perhaps it would be worthy of a blog post to answer some more that have come in that we haven't gotten to.
So, Linda, I want to thank you and everybody for being on the call. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for the opportunity.
You bet. You did a great job. Thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody for submitting their questions. And although we may not have gotten to all of them, once again, I'm going to share them what's left with Colette. And also, you're also welcome to log into our Food and Cooking Support Forum and post your questions there. We've got a lot of really knowledgeable parents who are willing to help you out. So I'd like to close with the last few comments since we're already at the top of the hour. We're a nonprofit charity, Kids with Food Allergies Foundation. So if you enjoy these webinars, you know, we make them possible through donations and sponsorships. So you know, keep us in mind when you're making decisions on your end of the year charitable giving. We'll be following up this presentation with an email probably tomorrow or the following day, and in it will be some tips and other things that maybe we will have covered in this webinar. But also we're going to give you a link to the archived version of this, so if you need to check on some of the slides, I know there was a few questions about the slides, you can always view that for free on our website as a follow-up. And then also when we close this webinar presentation, you will see a survey, and we would love to hear your feedback about what you thought about the webinar today and give us your impressions. So with that, I'd like to thank Colette and Deb so much for being here today, and for Melanie Carver, who's our web developer, who was running the slideshow and keeping all the technical stuff working, although I know my mic was not something that she could help me with. So I'm sorry again about my voice. But in any case, I want to thank you for being here, and we're going to go ahead and close out the webinar right now and look for the email and the webinar link in case you want to check it out again.